Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're going to be talking in this series of lectures about the manifestation of the Roaring Twenties known as the Ballyhoo Years. Ballyhoo is not a word that we hear too much anymore, but it suggests bluster and bombast and importance and significance. It was a phrase used by the chronicler of the 1920s named Frederick Lewis Allen, who first used that phrase to suggest that the events and the figures and celebrities and heroes of the 1920s were somehow bigger and perhaps more important than other eras. And in fact, it is this suggestion of the importance and the sensation associated with the stories of the 20s that lends itself to the idea of the Roaring Twenties. We talked in previous lectures about the economic prosperity of the 20s, some of the moral changes going on at that time, and consumerism, all of which created an atmosphere in which the excitement and sensation known as the Roaring Twenties was possible. But there were other things that went into the creation of memorable national stories that seemed to tumble upon us one after the other in the 1920s. So one element of this is mass production, which was not only for automobiles and other products, but also for the news and media and news stories. The United States became a country of faddists, everyone drawn to the same stories and the same trends at the same time. Much of this was made possible by the media. There were fewer newspapers actually in this era, but with larger overall circulations, so more people were reading the same stories at the same time. Also, there were a number of national magazines growing with national advertising. And we've already talked about the introduction of the radio, which was spreading throughout this decade, and again spreading the same stories and events to everyone across the country. During this era, also, newspapers and magazines began to understand that more papers would be sold if they could attract massive numbers of readers to one big story at a time. Front-page headlines became bigger, and lead stories dominated whole pages. Consumers would suck up these papers for days on end as they followed these gripping stories one after the other. In the 1920s, stories of only mildly sensational trials or other events outsold newspapers from the day of the Titanic disaster or the armistice ending World War I, for instance. So we really were drawn to almost any story with any kind of a gripping storyline to it. The American public enjoyed a series of fads during the 1920s. In the early 20s, the nation was swept by a craze for the Chinese game Mahjong. The Mahjong League of America was formed, and it was common to hear Americans debating the rules of the game and finer points of strategy on the streets. In 1924, a resourceful young man named Richard Simon joined with his friend Schuster to form a publishing company based on one idea, a book of crossword puzzles. Within a year, a craze for crossword puzzles swept across the nation, and Simon and Schuster became one of the leading publishing houses in the country. Sales of their books of crosswords ranged into the hundreds of thousands, and dozens of different editions followed. Sales of Roget's Thesaurus and the dictionary were swept along on the craze. There were tales of divorces because husbands were consumed with solving puzzles. And one man was even arrested for refusing to leave a restaurant after 4 hours working on one crossword puzzle. The crossword puzzle fad faded in 1925, but was followed by a trivia fad in 1926, and shortly after by contract bridge and other card games. While these fads were in full swing, Americans grabbed on to a number of news stories and events. National elections and the Harding scandals were pushed off the front pages by the discovery of King Tut's tomb in Egypt in 1922. A near-total eclipse of the sun in September 1923, which was visible in Los Angeles and Southern California. The 1924 Olympics, which are more famous to those of us today as the Chariots of Fire Olympics, the famous film made about them. And the tragedy of Floyd Collins in 1925. Floyd Collins was a young boy from Kentucky who was exploring a branch of Mammoth Cave. He climbed 125 feet down a narrow crevasse where his foot was pinned by a rock slide. There were great efforts to save him, and one slight man actually climbed down close enough to interview Collins. The story was front-page news around the country for more than 2 weeks. Finally, after 17 days, Collins died. His trapped foot was amputated to retrieve the body for burial. He died on February 17, 1925. In the summer of 1925, it was the Scopes monkey trial that seized front-page headlines for weeks. We're going to be talking much more about the Scopes trial in future lectures. In 1926, public attention was grabbed by the epic voyage of Admiral Byrd and his crew, ultimately flying successfully over the South Pole. Also, the disappearance of one of the great evangelists of the period, Aimee Semple McPherson, who was on par with Billy Sunday as the best-known preacher in the nation. McPherson ultimately returned home safely, but under mysterious circumstances. Another huge story in 1926 was the death and funeral of Rudolph Valentino, a major motion picture star who died at the age of 31. This was one of the first great funerals for a celebrity, and he was also one of the first male sex symbols. The attention given to his viewing and funeral drove ticket sales to his posthumous film releases, making an estate once mired in debt into $1 million fortune. In 1927, the biggest story was the flight of Charles Lindbergh across the Atlantic from New York to Paris. And we're going to talk more about this event in the next lecture. We'll also talk more about one of the other big stories in 1927, a series of floods which swept across the country and did incredible damage. But one of the other big headline-grabbing stories in 1927 was the execution of Sacko and Vanzetti, which I've mentioned previously when we talked about the Red Scare. This story lingered in the public consciousness throughout the decade because it was in 1920, in April, that Sacko and Vanzetti were arrested for murdering the paymaster from the shoe store where they were working. The crime itself and their role in it was mired in controversy. What followed was a hasty trial that most observers, even at that time, and certainly all historians, would consider to be grossly unfair. The judge, a deeply prejudiced man, boasted about what he would do with, quote, those anarchist bastards. Indeed, Sacko and Vanzetti were anarchists, but that had nothing to do with the murder case itself and shouldn't have been admitted as evidence in the case. But the judge allowed it, and the prosecutors repeatedly harped on Sacko and Vanzetti's politics and their status as immigrants. Sacko and Vanzetti were convicted and sentenced to death. At the height of the Red Scare in 1920, this verdict made sense to some. But as years passed, growing public outcry sought to have the verdict overturned, or at least a new trial for Sacko and Vanzetti. This drama dragged on throughout the decade until, as mentioned, they were finally executed in 1927. Were Sacko and Vanzetti actually guilty of this crime? Well, there is a degree of uncertainty. We can't completely vindicate or clear their record. In fact, one of the bullets at the scene did come from a gun that was owned by Nicola Sacco, but many historians believe the gun was planted and that neither Sacco or Vanzetti was directly involved in the crime. And in fact, 50 years after their execution, Governor Michael Dukakis vindicated Sacco and Vanzetti on August 23rd, declaring it Sacco and Vanzetti Memorial Day. Any stigma and disgrace shall be forever removed from their names, Dukakis proclaimed. By 1928, headlines turned to the coming presidential election, as well as the booming stock market and prosperity of that era. And of course, by the end of the decade, the woes of the Great Depression took over. In the next several lectures, we're going to be examining some of these episodes in more detail, starting with perhaps the most sensational event of the decade, the Scopes monkey trial in 1925.